Hi all, and welcome to another Lunch and Learn. So today what we're going to go through is how do I send data to my app. We're also going to touch on a brief intro into caching. We'll go through that in a future Lunch and Learn as well. So today we're going to be talking around apps and data. So first things first is what is it? So apps have two modes where they can essentially render data to the end users. The one is what I would call static, which means when you design the app, it'll appear there. The second is what I would say is dynamic. So information that's going to change, information that gets calculated, information that could be from an expression, etc. So static values are done at design time. Dynamic value is either provided. Now there's a few mechanisms of how you can provide it. We'll touch on both of them. One is through a data stream, and the second is a connector inside the app designer. We'll also touch on caching. So when you do caching in a data stream, it is how often and how much data should be cached that is made available to the app when it is rendering. Some of the concepts we're going to touch, XMPro Action Agent, that'll be the first one with inside a data stream. The second is going to be connectors inside the app designer. We'll also touch on briefly caching all or per an entity, some basic requirements that you're going to need. It's going to require access to the app designer, access to the data stream designer, and you need a basic idea of what data it is that you're looking to display. So what information are you looking to present to the screen, and where do you want it to be? How do you want to access it? Is there any filters, etc.? Skill level for this, we're still in the beginner-friendly area. It can start to go into the intermediate area as well. So first area is, let's jump into the actual software itself. So before we can actually start tying data to an app, let's go and create ourselves a new app. We're just going to call this Lunch and Learn for today. We're going to put it into my sandbox, and we're going to keep everything else as the default. Now, if I go into this actual app itself and I try and launch it, it's going to not give me anything. It's going to be bare basics. There's not much information in here as well. Now what I can start doing is I can start going through here and I can start configuring information. So let's say I want to actually create some additional columns. I can do that. If I want the first one to be asset information, I can just double click and change that information there. If I now want to start bringing in a little bit more, I can drag in a box into there. I can now go back, and from layouts, I'm going to drag in a stack layout and bring that into the other side as well. So you configure your form exactly the same way as you would have previously. However, now what you can start doing is when you start bringing information into the screen here. So I could very well call this asset number. And if I go and duplicate that, and I'm just going to change the flex so that we go from left to right, so I can see that. I can come into the asset number and I can rename it from a static perspective. And if I go and render the screen, you'll see asset number will come through. So you can very quickly create static information on a screen. However, that's not very useful. Most of the information you want to have changed, so you need to pass this information through to the form so that you can actually access it and make it available. So we're just going to go back into the edit mode for this particular app. We'll come back to the app itself. So the first area of where data is made available to an application is inside the data stream designer. I've got an example here, but I'll show you how we can actually create one. So for this particular example, we are using the event simulator to generate some data. So we've got specific data that we're interested in. We are then creating some asset numbers. We are rounding it to make sure that when we get to the UI side, that the information is consistent, 2 decimals, 3, etc. If you don't round here, You can still round inside the app designer. Then you start going into the expressions on an actual data source. We'll start covering that in a future session as well. We're then going to broadcast and then we publish to an app. However, what I'm going to do with this example is I'm going to clone it. And we're going to configure it for different bits and pieces. So for now, what I'm going to get rid of is the last two pieces to my data stream. It does not matter where your data is coming from. There's a lot of different listeners of where my information is coming from. To the point I made earlier, you need to have at least an idea of what data are we trying to present on the form. What shape should that data be in? Where's it coming from? Do I need to join data from different data streams, etc.? If I were to run this particular data stream now, and I go into my live view, and I bring the rounding, and I bring my generate data up, you'll see my values will come through. If I expand that, I can see the generate column, and I can see the rounding column. So my data is flowing through my particular data stream. However, it is not available on my app side. I can't actually view it or see it. Now, how I know that is I'm looking for lunch and learn from a data stream perspective. So if I go back to the app now, how we bind data to an app is on the page data side of things. If I scroll all the way to the left, you'll see there is app data on the application level. The page level allows me to use data sources that have been defined. Data sources get defined at an application level. Now, do I have to remember every single time to scroll left and go to the app data to create them? No, you don't. If you've forgotten or you haven't got that far yet, you can click the plus on the data sources side of things. It's going to ask you for a name, but you'll see in the connection, it'll give you some options in there. However, if the one you're looking for is not available in the section here, you can actually click the plus and it'll bring up a list of a lot of different connections that you can actually use as well. So how do we actually do that? If I go all the way to the left, I'm going to go and delete these two. So let's say we go and get rid of those and they're not available. If I want to add a new data source to this page, I go to the page data and I click the plus. So what we're doing is we're trying to bind a data source to be able to be used on this particular page. On the right, you'll see connections. We have nothing. It says no data to display there. If I click the plus, it's going to give me some options. So I'm looking for the data stream. We're going to give it a name. And everything else we can leave as default, and we can click save. Now what will happen is under the drop down, you'll see I have a data stream that is now available. So what we've just done there is instead of me scrolling all the way to the left and clicking app data to add it, I'm able to add it at the page layer as well. Very handy if you haven't done it or you only get to it halfway through the app page when you're configuring it versus having to remember every single time. We can now give it a name at the top. However, if I go into entity and I search for lunch and learn, I don't get anything. Nothing's available here. And the reason for that is the only data streams that will appear here are ones that have been configured to make its data available to a data stream. So what do I mean by that? Under Action Agents, if you scroll all the way to the bottom, or you can type in the search at the top, and it'll filter the list for you. You need to drag on an XMPro app and add it to your data stream. So I'm going to unpublish my data stream, and we're just going to save that. So the first thing is you need to tell the data stream you're going to be making your data available to the app designer. So that's step one. Step two, make sure you give it a name that is appropriate. The reason for that is when you come into the app designer here, it's going to register those different endpoints, and you can have multiple. So I can have one in here as an example. So let me say I have a broadcast and I send that to the broadcast. And my first value comes to that XMPro. And then if I search for the XMPro app again, now we put that here, I could have the next one go to the same. You can have multiple of these on a data stream. Why would you want multiple? If your data stream is doing different calculations on the data, you may want a certain section of that to be in a certain area on the app. You may want the results of the calculation in another area of the app. So there are reasons where you want to have duplicate XMPro apps on a data stream. It'll become obvious when we go into a lunch and learn around caching and making data available to charts why you would have to. But just remember, you can have multiple of these on a data stream. The second thing is, if you double click that, you need to configure it. You can't just drag it on and leave it. There is configuration that you do need to do on the XMPro app. First thing is, where is the URL? This will point to the app designer URL. Integration key, this will point to your app designer key as well. If you scroll down, you can ignore the cache settings for now. It's going to ask you for an identifier. So what is the identifier for this data flowing through? Typically, it is an asset number, but you have flexibility to use other fields as a identifier as well. If I go in there, I can pick asset number. It's also going to ask you what's my primary key. 9 out of 10 times, it'll be an asset number as well. If I go back to the second one, and I do the same thing there, we're going to configure both of those, and I go all the way to the bottom. Identifier is going to be asset number, and primary key is going to be asset number. Make sure you click apply at the top. If you don't, you'll notice if I go back to the first one, it hasn't saved my changes. Very important to remember that. So we go into the first two, we're going to scroll down, we're going to fill the asset number in and select it. Make sure you click apply to persist the changes you made, and then make sure you click save or Control S on your keyboard to save the data stream. Now if I go back to my my app that I am configuring, and if I try and close that out, and I go back to the data source side, and we select data stream, and in here we're looking for lunch and learn. So now if I expand that, it'll show me my lunch and learn coming in there as well for it. So previously it was not available. Here you can see I have availability to pretty much everything that has an endpoint for all the different data points coming through. So if I go down to my examples, they'll appear in here as well. However, what we forgot to do on this side is we forgot to name them appropriately. Now, because we haven't named them appropriately, it's going to be quite hard when we get to the app side to make sure we're using the correct one. As I mentioned, you can have multiple of these on a data stream, so it's good practice to make sure you name them appropriately. For now, we're just going to say send data to app, and I'm going to leave the other one. We'll come back to this in a future lunch and learn as well. Make sure we name our broadcast so that we understand what this particular data stream is doing. If I go back into the configuration for this, you'll see there's a caching section here. What the caching section here is saying, what's my initial cache size? So how much data do I want to keep in cache? And then you have a few options. The first one says replace cache. What that does is, if my cache size is 20 and I have 21 items coming through my payload, by the time it gets here, it's going to drop off the first one and add a new one at the back. And it's going to keep doing that as the data is coming through the data stream and being made available. If I tell it replace cache, what that does is any new payload that comes all the way through to this endpoint replaces the prior cached payload. So if you have a record that only comes through, let's say, every 5 minutes, but your data is flowing every minute, what will happen is if you were to set replace cache, you could end up with a situation where in that 4-minute window, you might have no data displaying on your actual app side itself as well. So replace cache will allow you to replace everything every time, but just be aware if your data comes in at different intervals for different asset types as well. The other one is cache per entity. Cache per entity allows me to make use of this cache, but per the identifier that we've got at the bottom. If I was to select that, what this is now saying is my cache size is going to be 20 per asset number. So if I have 10 assets and each of those has records coming through, I can cache 20 per 10. So suddenly my 20 has gone up by a factor of 10. So my cache size is going to be 200 in that scenario. The defaults is everything unchecked. So replace cache is unchecked and cache per entity is unchecked as well. If I run this now and I go to live view, I can now open up the send data to app, and we can keep the top one. So generate data is coming from my event simulator. Send data to app is what's coming through my endpoint here. So step one before you can get data into your app designer is to make sure, do you have an XMPro app agent on your canvas, and have you configured it correctly? Now we can go into our app designer here, and I can actually go into my data source, and I can say we're going to connect to some live data. And in here, you'll see I have access to a lot of different areas for it. If I go back and I have a look at the lunch and learn, just rename that differently here, and it's in display data, so let's unpublish that, and let's republish that. So if I go down in here to my display data, and I scroll all the way down, I'll be able to see there is my lunch and learn, and there are my two fields that have been bound. This is why naming is important. If you were to leave them both as XMPro _0, XMPro app _1, XMPro app _2, you won't know which of those endpoints are the ones you're looking for. So which of them has the calculations you may have done, which of them has the raw telemetry data, and which of them maybe has data with a different caching option that you want to use for charts, as an example. If you haven't named them appropriately, you're going to struggle getting to this point, especially if you are sharing this data stream with other users and they are using them to consume the data, but they're not necessarily fully across how the data stream functions, where it gets its data, etc. So the first thing that we want to do is we select the send data to the app itself. What you'll notice it'll do is it interrogates it and gets the primary key. Now, what you'll notice is I made the entire configuration maximized, and the reason I do that is so that I can see everything on the screen. To do that, you can double click the header, or you can click the maximize option at the top there. This is especially useful if you have a lot of data streams to go through that have been bound to the XMPro app connector, and you want to find what you're looking for. So it's interrogated the configuration, and it's automatically brought in the primary key as you configured it down the bottom here. So if I go down here, remember we set the primary key was asset number. Primary key is important over here for the data when you start doing advanced data manipulation and advanced data work in the app designer. The next thing to make sure you tick is when you're accessing live data, make sure you tick live data updates. If you hover over the eye, it'll tell you what it actually does. But the live data updates is what enables you to get the record constantly. It allows you to automatically update the values without refreshing the page. There are some connectors, for instance, if you're connecting to SQL and the option's not enabled on SQL, you won't get this option here. But when you're connecting to data streams, there's no reason for you not to tick this option. It's also one of the first things I suggest people check when they're saying, well, my data is not flowing through to my app, even though I am getting data in a data stream. First thing to check and make sure is, have you enabled live updates here? We're going to click Save. And as soon as we've done that, what you'll notice is Data Sources here has a new option underneath it. It's got the name that we've defined. So again, make sure the names you're using inside your app here make sense. And if someone else was to use them and look at them, make sense to them as well. We bring in all the data fields. They're also bound to what their data type is, so you can see if they're decimal, strings, date times, etc. There is an area for you to calculate and create expressions. We'll cover that in another Lunch and Learn as well. So if you're not sure what fields will be made available, what can I actually view and read, just go to the page data, expand the data sources, and you have access to the information here. Now what we can do is we can actually bind this information to the element we're looking for. Again, if you're looking for a data source that's not here, so let's say we don't want to bind this to live data, you can click the plus. Brings you to exactly the same place. So you do not have to go back to the page data and click the plus here every time to add a new data source. You can do it from within the area that you're busy with. Fill the information in, and once you've done that, it'll refresh the drop down for you here. We can close that out, and we can now select the data source. As soon as we've done that, you'll see we get a yellow border that comes around. And if I go into the text and I go to the appearance, I can now click the A, which is static. It then turns into a dynamic, and now I get a drop down. This drop down is now bound to that same data source, so now I can actually bind it to the asset number field coming in. If I was to save that and I run the, you'll see the asset number now is being passed through from the actual app. Now what I can start doing is if I go back and edit the app, I can actually go through for this particular box and I can duplicate that. And this one here we can say is reading number, and I can go into that field, go to its appearance, and change it to reading number as an example. We can now save that. Now what you'll notice is the number keeps going up. So the live data, the checkbox that we selected, is what is enabling this to constantly change its value without me having to refresh the screen. There are areas where you get, I would say, static type information coming through, but without ticking that, you would have to refresh the screen every time to get that information to come through. The second area where you can actually configure it in an app is if I go to the app data side, there are specific, if I go to SQL, there are specific connectors that will allow you to connect directly to data sources as well. Each of those is available for you to connect as you need to. The primary one that gets used is the data stream connector here, but there are other connectors that do not require a data stream, and you can connect directly to the systems. The only functionality that you might lose by doing that is the live view option. So again, if I click the pencil next to my existing data stream here, this option might not be supported if you connect directly to the systems of choice. It's not all of them supported, which means if you are connecting to those systems and you do want that data to refresh, the screen will need to be manually refreshed to do that as well. So just to recap, if we come back to the data stream, so where's the first area that I go to connect data to my app? Inside a data stream, what you want to do is under XMPro agents, right at the bottom, you'll see the XMPro app. That is the key that allows you to connect it to a app and make it available. Make sure you name them appropriately. Otherwise, when you're configuring it on the other side, you might have some problems trying to remember which one is for which one. We'll go into a lot more detail on the caching options in a future Lunch and Learn as well. For now, you can use the defaults to return the data coming in. Step 1 is done in the data stream. Step 2, you do in the app designer side. Again, you can scroll all the way and at an app data level add a new connector, or you can do it at the page level. So page level is where you're creating an instance connecting to a specific data stream, connecting to a specific table, or whatever system it is that you're connecting to. The plus will walk you through the steps. So if there's something in the connection that you know is available but you can't see it yet, click the plus there again and it'll walk you through that as well. Once you've selected your items, make sure you remember the live data update section. Otherwise, what's going to happen is your information is going to stay static on the screen and you're not going to get the information constantly refreshing itself coming through as well. Thank you all for attending today. How do I bind data to my app? Most of it gets done through a data stream using the app agent. There are ways to do it directly through data sources in the app designer. You, however, will lose some functionality there as well, but it is very possible to do that as well. Thank you again for attending today's Lunch and Learn. Hope to see you on some future ones.